Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is Classical Age Empires, Part 2, Part 3, however you want to look at it, but the topic today is Rome. Now, as always, before we begin, take a moment, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get going. Now, we're going to go back to the Mediterranean today to discuss Rome. Again, this lecture may have fit better a lecture and a half ago, but Rome was such a big topic. It is probably the most well-known empire. It's the subject of countless movies, series on TV, streaming, art, and even heavily discussed within Christian churches. Now, we're going to start with the Roman Republic, an almost mythical idea that, well, is more myth than reality. Now, one of the things that makes the Roman Republic endure, both in reality and imagination, was its balance. In fact, according to a Greek historian, Polybius, he said, and I quote, "The three kinds of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, were all found united in Rome. And it was no easy to determine with assurance whether the entire state was an aristocracy, a democracy, or a monarchy," unquote. And I think that idea almost perfectly encapsulates this amalgamation mythical idea that is Rome. Because at times there were some democratic ideals that, many as Americans like to look to in historical annals, and ideally the idea of Western civilization courses in college are meant to taught that progression and progress and enlightenment from the Greeks to the Romans to the Europeans to the Americans. At the same time, it was an aristocracy, as we're going to see, even during the Republic age. And then, of course, there is it became a monarchy, a dictatorship under Caesar. And we like to learn the lesson, especially in the United States, that we should look to Rome as this place that we can learn from. Well, the problem is we're learning the wrong lessons. Or perhaps we're learning the wrong lessons. Because the lesson that we are often taught is that we want to set it up as a republic to give people a voice. But maybe perhaps the lesson we need to learn was the Roman dictatorship, or was the Roman Empire? Was that transition from a republic to a dictatorship inevitable? And if so, what can we learn from that to prevent it from happening, here? Now, let's begin. So, myth. Romans started out with a myth. The idea of Rome was built on a complete and utter myth. There's this myth that the city of Rome was founded by Romulus, who was the son of the war god Mars and the descendant of Aeneas of Troy. Now, Romulus, along with his twin brother, Remus, were both suckled by a she-wolf, as you can see pictured on my screen, before being raised by a shepherd, Faustulus, who then took revenge on their usurping great-uncle, Aemilius. Now, the brothers then decided they were going to establish a new city, a new town. But they got into it with each other, some quarreling over the details that ended up in Remus's murder and the establishment of Rome on the Palatine Hill. Again, there's a mythical origin to the literal city of Rome. Now, myth aside, the real founding of Rome, when we actually pick up our story, though, occurs as the Greek Empire is declining. Once the Roman army conquered Greece, soon after Alexander the Great's death. And this really begins this new age that we begin with, but we're titling the Roman Empire, but again, technically speaking, in 509 BCE, this is the Roman Republic. Now, there's an old saying, you see at the bottom of the screen, that Rome captured Greece, but Greece captivated Rome. Why? Because even though, yes, the Romans took over the land, much of the Greek influence on the Italian mainland continued. Romans adopted many aspects of Greek culture, including architecture, philosophy, literature. They even traded the Greek gods, like they retained them. They just changed their names to Roman names. And of course, also the Latin language. But what this begins, starting in about 509 BCE, is a 1,000-year domination. Nearly a 2,000-year domination if you count the Eastern Empire when it splits off. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there. So we begin in 509 BCE when the Romans successfully push back the Greeks and they reclaim Rome. It begins as the Roman Republic that will then see expansion into Italy and then across the Mediterranean, as you see on the left of my screen. But I know I'm coming back to this point. I'm probably going to belabor this point today. There's a reason, however, that George Lucas in the Star Wars prequels showed the decline of the Republic into an empire. George Lucas was an avid fan of history, and he tried to model it on a couple different historical narratives. And what he shows in those Star Wars prequels, though many have kind of chastised him over the years as far as they're not as good as they probably should be, there's a genius in them, though. And that is, it wasn't the big, bombastic, I am a dictator and going to take you over. No, that's what happened when they already were an empire in the original trilogy. You have the Emperor, you have Darth Vader, who just do bad guy things. No, the genius of the prequels, whether you like him or not, the story of the prequels was how a wannabe dictator, Palpatine, manipulated the rules of the Republic, created a situation, created a environment, created through the mundane trade policy, attacks in the Outer Rim, tariffs, causing higher prices because the supply line chains were being blockaded. It created a situation where Palpatine could be temporarily a dictator. And then once he becomes a temporary dictator, takes full control. And it's a story we've seen replayed in history time and time again, whether in the Roman Republic or, of course, later in what became Nazi Germany. So, again, I'm probably going to come back to that point more than once in this lecture, but I want to understand this has great relevance to today. Because we are a, democratic republic, the United States. Can we fall into a dictatorship? Time will tell. But, nonetheless, the Roman Republic. Now, the Roman Republic was set up. It had a Senate. It had councils. It had assemblies. The most important body in this was the Senate. And they were the most important ruling body who controlled most all political decisions. These were generally made of patricians, or aristocrats. Positions that were hereditary, that were passed on from father to son, based on wealth. Now, Rome was divided into two broad classes of people. There were the patricians, a small number of aristocratic rich families, and the plebeians, basically everyone else who was Roman. The Senate was kind of a mixture of legislature and giant advisory council. The main job was to set policy for the consuls, those who were beneath them. Each year, the Senate would choose from among its ranks 2 co-consuls so that they could check each other's ambitions. Again, don't put one person in charge because one person will get selfish and try to take over things. So put 2, rule of 2. And they would serve as the co-consuls to Rome to kind of lead and direct the Republic. And by having 2 of them, they could put a check on each other for, selfish ambition. And so, most often, however, one would take care of domestic issues and one would take care of, outside kind of foreign affair issues such as fighting off wars, conquering new territory. Now, initially, these consul positions were 1-year terms, but over time that would change. They could veto each other. They were usually military men, thus also highly competitive. And these 2 consuls held great sway over the Republic, even though they are appointed from among the senators. Now, aside from there, you have what's called the General Assembly. These are made up of plebeians who make up 90% of the population. They actually had little power. Eventually, they would be allowed to have representatives that were called tribunes, but in reality, it was more an illusionary power than actual power. It was more like suggestions. They were, however, elected by the people, which gave people at least the sense that they had some say in the government. But as we're going to, kind of show you, ultimately they're kind of controlled and dominated and put down by the Senate. Now, economically speaking, there's a lot of agriculture around Rome and a lot of use of slavery. They did, however, also establish a wide Mediterranean trade network that would help them grow and expand their republic, until the point where it becomes the empire, where they will expand beyond their borders. Now, so how does it end? Or why does it end? And of course, that's a really important question because, again, can it happen, say, in the United States? Well, the Roman Republic had long had this position of dictator. And this is an important point. It is the one thing that connects Rome to, say, 1930s Germany, but that we don't have technically in the United States. And that is, there was long this position within the government, in the rule book, called what we would call a dictator. A person who would take temporary control in the event that the Republic was in imminent danger. Again, this is what you see in the Star Wars prequels. Palpatine is elected temporary dictator because there's a crisis that he manufactured that allowed him to get elected as dictator. We see it again in 1930s Germany. Things were bad in Germany. Hitler and the Nazi Party created a situation. In this case, there was a fire at the German Capitol building called the Reichstag. And we believe wholeheartedly, as scholars, as historians, that this was most likely, like 99.9% were sure, this was set by Nazis. Now, I'm not saying they did it themselves. They hired someone to do it. They perpetrated it. And then they took this very real, imminent danger, again, your Capitol building's on fire, to declare an emergency. There was a provision in the German Constitution called the Enabling Act that gave, in the event of emergency, one man to take temporary dictator powers for a period of 1 year to restore order. Hitler did this. He became the dictator. And then when the president died within that year, natural causes, Hitler simply merged those 2 offices and became unquestioned Führer, dictator. The same as Emperor Palpatine did after he took control of the Senate. As temporary dictator, he becomes, Emperor Palpatine. All that said, whether Star Wars or Germany, that was not new. That's exactly what happened in Rome. So the Roman Republic long had the position of dictator, a person who would take over events in the case of a national emergency. Now, the paradigm for this was the selfless Roman ruler who was Cincinnatus. He was a general who came out of retirement to defend the country. He lived on a plantation, had a farm. He would take command of the army, defeat whatever military that was trying to attack Rome, and then he would simply lay down his command and return to his farm. George Washington, first U.S. president, was heavily influenced by him when he kind of created this idea of a two-term president. Now, understand, from George Washington in 1783 all the way through 1940s, there was just merely a tradition that a U.S. president would serve 2 terms. That changed, however, during the Great Depression and World War II with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times. After this, the United States put a constitutional amendment that says a president may only serve 2 terms. So that is now law. But, again, this idea of George Washington was modeled after the idea of Cincinnatus of ancient Rome. Enter Julius Caesar. He was a wealthy man, came from the senatorial class. He's an aristocrat. And so it was natural that Julius Caesar would serve in both the army and the Senate, which he did. He rose through the ranks, and after some top-notch, ability as a general, he got a gig as the governor of Spain. He then decided to run for consul. He succeeded in becoming a consul in 59 BCE, and thereafter sought to dominate Roman politics by allying himself with Crassus. You see him on the screen, who was also a very wealthy, powerful man, and a general, Pompey. So here we have is a very ambitious consul, a very wealth backer in Crassus, and we have a very dangerous, powerful general. This establishes what's called the triumvirate, or rule of 3. You have Julius Caesar, who's the charismatic patrician and general. You have the wealthy Crassus to back and fund them, and you have the rival general Pompey. Now, after a year as consul that included the Senate, getting the Senate to pass laws, largely because of Pompey's troops, Caesar landed the governorship of Gaul. It's a northern territory, or at least the southern part of it. You see on the map there. He quickly conquered the rest of Gaul, and his 4 large armies, or legions as the Romans called them, became his source of power. Caesar continued his conquest, invading Britain and waging another successful war against the Gauls. But while he's away, Crassus dies in battle with the Parthians. And Pompey, who becomes Caesar's rival during this time and enemy, was elected as the new consul. Pompey and the Senate tried to strip Caesar of his command and recall him to Rome. Now, understand, if Caesar returned to Rome without an army, Caesar would likely be prosecuted for corrupt counseling, and also probably exceeding his authority as governor. So instead, he returns with his 13th legion. Now, Caesar went out to kill Pompey, though Caesar didn't know Pompey had already been killed. And Caesar made his way back from Egypt to Rome, stopping off to defeat a few kings along the way, and was declared dictator. This position was extended for 10 years, and then for life. He was elected consul in 46 BCE, and again in 45 BCE. The last time, however, without a co-consul, no one to check him. By 45 BCE, Caesar was the undisputed master, dictator of Rome. And he would pursue reforms to strengthen his own power. He provided land grant pensions for his soldiers, restructured the debts of many of Rome's debtors, and changed the calendar to make it more like the one we use today. But by 44 BCE, many senators had decided Caesar controlled too much of the power in Rome. So, long story short, Caesar declared himself dictator. But in 44 BCE, the senators realized, he's been given too much power. And so, they decide to assassinate him. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, they stabbed him 23 times. Now, they hoped that the death of Caesar would bring about the restoration of the Roman Republic. They were wrong. For one thing, Caesar's reforms were actually really popular among the Roman people. And the people themselves were quick to hail that Caesar's adopted son Octavian would be the one who should take over. And Rome will quickly descend into a civil war. During this time, a second triumvirate develops. This time, Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Now, unlike the first one, which disintegrated pretty quickly, this one was an awesome failure, even more so, degenerating into a second civil war, as Octavian and Antony fought it out. Antony lost. Octavian won, changed his name to Caesar Augustus, became the sole ruler of Rome, and adopted the title of emperor. And so, following the victorious battle at Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian becomes the unquestioned dictator of Rome, changing his name to Caesar Augustus, establishing the Roman Empire. Now, he technically will keep around the council for the next 40 years, but it was, once again, just a figurehead. It had no real power. It was more the illusion of power. It was there in title with no actual authority. Now, even though he becomes Caesar, he becomes a dictator, or emperor, however you want to determine the word, he actually preferred the title Princip, which meant first citizen. Again, we get this idea now, even among the U.S. presidents, they are a citizen who is supposed to answer to the people. But, as we see, Octavian, like his adopted father, Julius, didn't really play out that way. They wanted to see themselves that way. That's not how it actually was in real life. Because he was a dictator. He overhauled the military. He overhauled the economy. He overhauled the government. Now, what did he actually do? Well, he had a number of accomplishments. He created civil service to help merchants and landowners have these new positions to help these, more experts help him rule Rome. Again, this idea of civil service. He codified Roman law. He added the law of the 12 tables to create a standard unified law across all the Roman Empire. So no matter where you live, if you're part of the Roman Empire, you're a Roman citizen and you are equal under the law, in theory. He created a network of officials to hear cases and administer the law in a fair and equitable manner. Now, again, on paper, not in practice. He reformed the military to reduce the size, but also create more professional soldiers. He also used the army to build roads and public works projects, while the navy was used to combat pirates in the Mediterranean. What Caesar Augustus does is establish what's called Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Now, this does not mean there were no wars. It just means that Rome was strong enough, peace through strength. They were strong enough to put down any rebellion, and most did not dare challenge them for quite a while. And as under Caesar Augustus, we see that the Roman Empire expanded to its largest extent. There was a relative period of peace and prosperity. The borders were stabilized, the people feared them, and trade thrived. Aristocrats controlled large plots of land still, and worked by tenant farmers. The elites were still called patricians, the common were still called plebeians. These were also known as pater families, who had complete authority over the family, and they tied the groups together through patron-client relationships. Patrons were men of wealth and power, and clients they would turn to patrons to help them through the day or help them through their year. help with needs or wants in return for military service or labor or political support. So they took the old idea of patricians and plebeians and took it to a new level here, where a plebeian could essentially give up something, whether it's political support, labor, or military service, in return for establishing a patron-client relationship. Again, it was the next level where, again, it's the illusion of power, but it's all about a relationship of favorability or doing someone a favor. Again, it mirrored the larger institution of the Roman Empire, which was, this is a place of business and wealth. And like many great of these empires, women were denigrated. Even upper class women were watched by their father, their husbands, and their sons. Now, technically they had more rights than Greek women. Many would help supervise family businesses, but they were still under the authority of the male. Now, the worst case scenario, however, was was slavery, which was termed social death. Now, there was a heavy use of slavery in Rome. And slave labor was indispensable, but also at the same time disposable. And slave labor was used everywhere, within households, within craft production. Gangs of slave were used for mining or in large estates. Look on the screen right now. This is a mosaic on the right. It shows the slave, Miro. He's a slave who's pouring a drink from a large vessel on his shoulder into a small bowl to the right hand of his master, Frustus, or Fructus. Miro was dressed in a short tunic draped over his left shoulder. His arms, legs, and right chest are visible. He is leaning forward toward his master and looks at him. He appears both taller and stronger than his master, who is dressed in a long tunic that only reveals his lower arms and feet. He looks down at the bowl and seems to pay little attention to his servant. Notice there's an inherently unequal dynamic here. Yes, the clothing to signify who's the master, who's the slave. But notice the strength of the slave. In many respects, you think this is the kind of person where if they really wanted to, they could overthrow their masters. It's what you see in movies like Gladiator. Now, there would be numerous forms of slave rebellions, or often called weapons of the weak. There would often be slowdowns in production, sabotage, runaways, slave markets. And, to be clear, punishment for running away for slaves was, well, very harsh. The most famous, more upscale slave revolt, however, occurred in 73 BCE, in well-known case of Spartacus. It was a slave rebellion of slaves trained for the gladiatorial games. Spartacus led a 2-year rampage of revenge up and down the Italian peninsula, freeing slaves, burning estates, and killing masters. Once crushed, the Roman crucified some 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way as a warning to future rebels, which, if you know U.S. history very well, this is also what the Puritans did to Native Americans in the 1600s when they put down the rebellion in the 1670s. They took the head off the Indian chiefs and put it on a pike and lined it in the town square as a warning for Indians. We also see it later in, say, in this case, that was actually pre-U.S. history, is, Puritan before the United States became an independent nation. Well, we see it in the case of, slave rebellions in the United States, such as Nat Turner's rebellion, where once caught, they hang the heads of all the conspirators almost as if they're mile-marking posts that lead up into the city. As a warning, this is what will happen if you try to rebel. A very, painful death. Now, in general speaking, Pax Romana was established by military rule. If a problem couldn't be fixed by the military, it simply just couldn't be fixed. Legionnaires, the military, were the engineers, builders, and major labor source. They were used to protect and expand trade by land and sea. They would extend their influence by using diplomats and merchants to broker treaties and trade, including, of course, silk. And during this time, we see the expansion of the empire once again through the Punic Wars. Carthage had control of the Western Mediterranean. In a series of war, Rome is going to burn the city of Carthage, salt the earth, and take control of the lands. This becomes a new Roman province in North Africa and becomes the breadbasket of Rome, able to feed the empire. Now, of course, this battle is most famous because the Carthaginians used elephants to try to climb over the mountains to retaliate. They'll be put down by the Roman legionnaires. Now, one of the things this showcased was that as Rome begins to expand, so does their culture. So this is not just a empire of just authoritarianism, it is a empire of culture. And they encouraged local colonies and local natives to regions to embrace what they call the Roman way. In fact, most people in both Europe and even Northern Africa were considered Roman citizens. They were considered Roman. If you ask them, they were Roman, but never seen Rome. Cities were built across the provinces that were meant to mirror Rome, from the arenas that they fought the gladiatorial games in to the public baths. And to be clear, some of their engineering feats were marvelous, right? I mean, the aqueducts, the roads, the bridges, the amphitheaters, all these things are monumental technological marvels. They pioneered new siege weaponry for the military. Their architecture by building domes and arches, the Pantheon, the Colosseum. Again, these are technological marvels. They also create new systems of bureaucratic administration, finance laws. And within that law system, they also established the idea of what's called precedent, which is the idea that once a court makes a ruling, it becomes a precedent for future rulings. Again, this is a very basic concept that we use in the United States. Judges are meant to interpret the law and determine how to apply it. And they also create the idea of natural law, that all people, in this case Roman citizens, are born with certain natural rights. Now, all this is good and well. But the reality is, there's going to be a long decline. So why? How? Well, number one is the issue of secession. There was a continuing problem over the uncertainty of emperor succession. The peak of Pax Romana occurred under Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE. But beginning with his son, Commodus, which again famously portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator, top left of your screen, the empire begins to fail. And these succession of weak rulers create an economic crisis. These rulers were weak, they were corrupt, they were incompetent, with very few exceptions other than Diocletian, who stopped the temporary slide. But once he dies off, it begins again. There were struggles over land distribution. There were struggles over the idea of maintaining their large borders. Again, it's hard to maintain your borders when they're so spread out and so large and vast, and nomadic invaders began to attack. It's a huge cost of defense to protect that long border so far from the capital. Trade decline. There was epidemic disease. Now, there will be a moment, though, of reckoning, and that's when Emperor Constantine takes over. He makes a couple of very fateful decisions that are going to forever alter the course of history in the Roman Empire. The first thing he does is he moves the capital from Rome eastward to what became Constantinople, named for him. And this, of course, becomes the center of what later became the Byzantine Empire. Again, not yet, it will become. Now, the thought was it was more centrally located, and it offered better connection for trade to the east, especially along, the Silk Road. And it was able to escape those threats of the Germanic tribes that were north of Rome that were a thorn in their side. Now, the second big thing that happened was that it is believed that Emperor Constantine also became the first emperor to adopt Christianity or convert to Christianity. Now, whether he did or not, we don't really know. It's believed he may have, but what we do know for sure is that he does make Christianity the official religion of the empire. And this is going to have tremendous consequences going forward, because if you know anything about Western history, whether it's world history or a Western Civ course, we know that once Christianity and ultimately the Catholic Church become tied with politics, well, the result is, the Holy Roman Empire that we'll talk about later, but also just a lot of corruption within the church. And there's literally a war called the 100 Years' War that's fought over religion, Christianity, the Crusades. All these things are the result, in large part, maybe it would have been inevitable either way, but because Constantine adopts Christianity. Now, what this does then is put Christianity in a precarious situation where now they have political power. But also, his move to Constantinople, on the one hand, may have been the right decision in the immediate, but it came at the sacrifice of the western part of the empire. Because those Germanic tribes began to attack even more, because now Rome was the outer edge of the empire, not the east side. And so really this is the beginning of the end. And in 395 BCE, Theodosius is going to make that split permanent and create eastern and western halves. And even though Justinian will try to unite it again, that will fail. And so we begin to see, as you see in the dates on the screen, by 476 CE, the Roman Empire is dead. The split had occurred in 395. By 476, less than 100 years later, the western half has fallen to be taken over and split up, but replaced largely by the Pope in control of a large majority of territory. And the eastern side will continue for another 1,000 years under the Byzantine Empire. Now, I do want to make one quick note here because she's of note, and that, of course, is Cleopatra. There's the split under Rome, so you see on the map here. So they moved the cursor here from Rome all the way over to Constantinople, modern-day Turkey. It was meant to be a better connection for the Silk Road trade, and hopefully to get rid of those issues of Germanic tribes. They basically traded one problem for another. And there, of course, is a picture of Constantine and, of course, Diocletian, who's going to separate the empire. Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a fascinating character. She's the subject of countless movies also. And almost fabled character in history. She's known as the last queen of Egypt. But what you may not know is she is the direct descendant of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. She's Greek by descent. She maneuvered to form alliances with powerful Romans, and she gave birth to Julius Caesar's child, wanting him to be the heir and ruler of Rome. She married Mark Antony. Remember, he was of the second triumvirate with Octavian? She backed the wrong horse. She chose the wrong person. She marries Mark Antony, sided with him in his war against Octavian. But then, when Mark Antony loses, she's now on the outs, and she's in trouble, and she knows it. Ultimately, she commits suicide by asp, snake. Back to the Byzantine Empire. So, in 476 CE, the Ostrogoths, these nomadic invaders, are going to sack Rome. The Western Empire was over. In the East, however, it will remain 1,000 years. The capital is Constantinople, and they will be heavily influencing social, political, economic development in modern-day Turkey, modern-day what became Eastern Europe, and of course, Russia. They are famous because of the helping Russia form a national identity in the Cyrillic alphabet. Their greatest contribution, however, is Justinian's Code. His reign marked an ambitious but only partly realized restoration of the empire. It was expressed by the partial recovery of territories in the Western Roman Empire. And again, ambitious but failed. But what he's most known for is Justinian's Code, this law code. It was meant to clarify and unify all previous laws and edicts from previous emperors, though it never actually worked as intended. And so in many ways, you could say that Justinian's law code is much like the Roman Empire. Every step of the way, the Roman Empire was trying to fix all the problems, but in the end, they just seem to create more problems. When Constantine moves the capital from west to east, he's thinking he's going to solve some problems of trade, but what he creates is a new problem of war. Well, Justinian's Code, again, tries to fix all the previous edicts and kind of codify them, but in the end, it just creates more questions than answers at times. But why do I talk about it? Because it does become the basis of modern civil law in what is now Eastern Europe. And this becomes a very important because it begins, and you see there in the dates on the screen, from 527 to 565 CE. This becomes the basis for modern European law. Again, important idea. So, how do we conclude all this? How do we compare all these classical age empires? What attributes align the Greeks with the Persians, with the Chinese, with the Romans, with the Americans? And you see a lot of them overlap at times, especially in Eurasia. But how do you justify? How do you wrap this all up? Well, first of all, number one, most all of these grew out of smaller city-states or kingdoms after a crisis or collapse. Again, even the Roman Empire, Roman Republic, that did. It was birthed out of the Roman Republic era. You see, in politically, they are moving toward a more centralized, bureaucratic, and/or imperial system. Most of them all relied on agriculture and trade networks. All were very similar, with a political and religious leaders at the top. They followed, in order, hierarchy of merchants, warriors, craftspeople, labor, and then slaves. With the one exception of China, who put merchants below the peasants. Now, in some of those societies, there was a chance to go up and down, though very little. Other societies, like the Indians and in the Chinese, there was more of a caste system. Especially in the Mauryan and Gupta empires. The Mayas and the Romans were much more dependent upon slaves than the Han. But all seem to have slave labor. Every one of these empires had labor provided by free people, indentured servants, and slaves. Religion was most often used to legitimize rulers, and then often used to spread across the empires via conquest and trade, which is what even you see that you don't see in early Rome, but one of the arguments of why Constantine may have adopted Christianity was to use it as a justification for his rule. We also see major technological innovations, major monumental architecture. We see writing and law codes. We see military innovations and new techniques and new implements of armaments. We also see that most of them decline for the same reasons: overextension, declining political power, in other words, weak rulers, internal disruptions caused by the economy or weak rulers, outside invasions. These four things seem to define all the empire's decline. Again, overextension, weak rulers, internal disputes, and outside invasions. And most took a long time to decline. These are not going to get sacked overnight. Now, maybe what's most interesting is what happens after. Because when these empires fall, the question becomes, do the people retain their cultural identity? And the answer is not always. For instance, in Rome, a lot of the Roman identity, even though the law codes remained, the architecture remained, the cultural Roman identity was gone. Whereas in China and India, they lost the political unity, but their civilization remained. Their cultural identity remained. And what we kind of figured then, it was not political power that united the people, but rather belief systems, a sense of identity in their religious beliefs, whether Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism. And while you could argue, well, didn't Rome have that too? The answer is yes, but that was adopted very late in the process when it was already declining. So it kind of was too little too late for Romans to embrace Christianity. Instead, we see that with the Holy Roman Empire coming up later. Now, in the Americas, we're not quite sure of why they declined, though we still believe it was largely either ecological disaster, more than likely just wars and overextension. Now, what we also realize, though, is one of the big things of all these empires is that they're going to greatly influence future governments, future empires. And the religious traditions, the technological innovations, are going to have profound effects that last to our present day. But we will continue this topic next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.